the two, right? How might you compare the two in terms of Jefferson's contradictions? So he says, for example, that these people are inferior, that the women prefer orangutans, all this kind of outlandish stuff. At the same time, he's having an affair with one of the slaves. So we wonder what that kind of says, right? But we as human beings tend to find ways to justify a lot of things we do. So maybe he's not that unique in that respect. He is one of the more complicated figures in American political history, I would definitely say. Again, author of the Declaration, yet also the owner of several hundred slaves. How do you figure that? How do you mesh those two together? Perhaps we can, perhaps we can't. Yes?
Well, here's a politician through and through. The one hand, he had his own beliefs about how a country should be.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, he had to say what would make the people happy.
True. So you say his own beliefs may, in some ways, differ from. That's an interesting point. If a politician has certain personal beliefs, yet the majority of the country feels a certain way, what do they do? Do you follow your personal beliefs? Do you do what you feel is in the general will of the population? I don't know. So if you think that you truly have the best path carved out for the nation, you might go against the general population and do what you think is right. Some folks do that, although that's undemocratic, right? That's going against the will of the people in that sense. But you make an important point, especially about his own beliefs versus what's happening in the country. In some ways, I think he's very unique in his thought. He's extremely intelligent figure. In other ways, he's very representative of what a lot of folks are thinking and doing at the time. Right? It's not that out of the ordinary. A lot of the behaviors and a lot of the things he's going to say. So that is important. More recently, there was kind of a renewed controversy around Jefferson. There had always been, like I said before, I think this sort of oral history of the fact that he had this relationship with Sally Hemings, one of his slaves, a long-term relationship, in fact. It came up during one of the elections, in fact, as his rival kind of threw that in his face. He always, stayed away from discussing that topic. It was always largely denied within the Jefferson family. But with the advent of DNA evidence, it was actually proven that this was the case. He fathered several children in the Hemings line or what have you. So it ended up being a sort of a debate again a few years ago. Several books came out and whatnot about it. Again, in some ways he's not that different than a lot of other folks living at the time. In other ways, maybe he is. And again, the Hemings side, they always kind of knew this. It had always been sort of passed down from generation to generation, who their ancestor was. In other ways, he's a contradiction too. Jefferson is again a Virginian, which is similar to some of the other presidents, but he really sort of identified himself more with the small farmer and almost with the western part of the state and with the frontier more generally. Right? It's interesting that he, as a Southerner, is not just a Southerner. He really is more closely identified with the frontier, the idea almost of the West, in addition to the South. Remember, Jefferson always is going to believe that the future direction of the country should be more agricultural. He thought that the true Americans, or the best Americans, the most invested Americans, would be those Americans who are specifically tied to the land or invested in the land in that sense. He had a real problem with cities. Again, now we think of cities and urban areas as sort of the future, the present and the future. But at the time, he thought that cities really were going to be a problem in American history, that they led to a lack of independence rather than an increase in independence. He thought that they led specifically to dependence. If you are a worker, a wage worker, and you're working for someone else, he said you're not really independent. You have to own something, plant your own crops, raise your own food, and then you're independent. You can vote the way you want to vote. One of the examples he always used was, what if you're a worker and you go, to the factory, and that day the factory owner says, okay, we're all voting for the Federalists today, right? Essentially, your vote could be bought, right? Because your employer, the one that's paying your salary, says you should vote a certain way. And if you think about how voting was done at this time, it wasn't like the way we do it now, where it's sort of silent. You go to the little booth and do it. Nobody knows who you vote for. A lot of times it would be done orally in a group. So you would cast your vote that way. Everybody knew who you voted for. So you kind of might have to do what your employer said. So in some ways he thought this was very dangerous to the idea of democracy, these cities talked about the growth of vice in cities and that they were these dirty places. And you really did not want the United States to go that direction. Again, this is going to be a later debate because it's not until 1920 that more Americans are going to live in cities than live on farms. But he's sort of anticipating that debate. And in some ways, it anticipates some of the tensions already developing in the new nation. There are a number of tensions that are rising in this period between about 1790, 1800, and the coming of the Civil War. Some say we're already on the road to Civil War. If you notice in the textbook, the way the chapters in this section are outlined, really, all the remaining chapters we look at really cover the same period. We're really looking at the same period between about 1790 and 1840, 1850. Chapter 7, or Chapter 8, 1790 to 1815. Chapter 9 is 1800 to 1840. Chapter 10 is 1815 to 1840. Chapter 11 is on the peculiar institution of slavery, so the antebellum period around the 1830s. Chapter 12, 1820 to 1840. So we're really looking at the same period through several different lenses to try to get a sense of what are the major arguments, the major debates, the major tensions. And Jefferson, in some ways, illustrates some of the earliest ones here. His orientation is really more towards the frontier, that the future of the country is going west, right, rather than the sort of Eastern sort of aristocracy or elite in many ways. Even though he himself is, very elite, he sort of patterns himself differently. He has this lifelong fascination with science and intellect. He's very much the intellectual, very classically trained and whatnot. Jefferson's first priority as president is reducing the national debt. Sound familiar? Going to an election year, you're going to hear a lot of talk about reducing the national debt. Right? It's a very common issue to be discussing around election time. He would set about cutting the federal budget. I would argue that that's not just about money. Right? It's also about a kind of philosophy of government itself. Remember this whole difference between the parties. To put it in 2015 terms, do you believe in big government or small government? Some of the same issues were kind of resonating for these figures. Jefferson is worried that government has gotten too large under the Federalists, and he wants to shrink it because when it's too large, it has too much power. It involves itself too much in the lives of individuals, perhaps. Where the Federalists were in favor of more federal power. Again, same debates, they're going to carry us closer and closer to civil war between the parties at that time. So, again, some of these issues are already being set up as early as the 1790s. So he sets about cutting the budget, primarily by reducing the size of the military. Remember, think about shrinking government power as well as government spending. Right? That had grown, the federal power and the armed forces had grown under President Adams, and Jefferson wants to reduce that. He cut taxes, including an excise tax on distilled grain that had helped spark the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794. Washington had responded to that Whiskey Rebellion in Pennsylvania. So he's going to cut taxes, cut the size of the military, two of the first things he does. What's interesting, though, is that although these were sort of Jefferson's strongly held beliefs, like you were saying, the sort of signal thing of his first administration went the other direction completely. He does what he thinks is in the best interest of the country, and that's going to be the Louisiana Purchase. 1803, the Louisiana Purchase kind of falls into our lap. In my other class, I was relating this to ideas of manifest destiny, and we'll talk about that term a little more. The ideas of the West, the ideas that the country should grow, the ideas that the United States was a land of chosen people. This is really kind of what's bound up in this notion of manifest destiny. Some trace the idea of manifest destiny all the way back to the Pilgrims. And the Pilgrims come and they want to set up this model society, right? They want to set up the city on the hill that's going to be a model for all other people to follow, other colonies to pattern themselves after, and other nations of the world. They think they're doing what God wants, right? That they're going to be a model, a beacon of light. Right? So part of that is this idea that they're a chosen people, right? That they have something to share with the world, religiously and ultimately politically. Right? The democracy itself, many argue, is kind of can be America's gift to the world. Right? So think about this as we think about this idea of manifest destiny that's developing, that it's our destiny to spread from the east all the way to the west coast. Some say it goes all the way back to the Pilgrims, right? And that we could see evidence or proof that God was on our side. Right? There's many people are going to see evidence that this is a chosen nation, an exceptional nation. Any number of terms might be used. I'll give you a couple of examples. The Pilgrims themselves, right? They come here and they almost die. They almost starve that first winter. We just got done celebrating Thanksgiving, right, where essentially they're saved. Native Americans help them out. God is on their side. Right? They don't die. Saw the same thing in the Chesapeake with the starving time, right? That first winter, 1609, 1610. They almost die, but they don't. So some say, look, we must be destined for something. 200 years before the term manifest destiny is coined, some say it's already kind of started in our mind that, okay, we must be here for some purpose. Fight a successful revolution against the most powerful land on the planet, right? We shouldn't have won that war on paper, right? Just like the Washington football team wasn't supposed to win this week, but they did. So in some respects, say, oh, God must have been on their side. God must have been on our side. We defeat the British. Defeat them again in the War of 1812. This Louisiana Purchase falls into our lap, right? Jefferson is going to send people expecting just to buy New Orleans, just to buy that port for about the same price, about $15 million. And he's offered the whole territory, which doubles the size of the country for $15 million without having to fire a shot. Some people say, wait a second, this is too good to be true. If it was a movie, you wouldn't believe it. It sounds like fiction. So think about this idea about, sort of God being on our side, this idea that some say still informs America's vision of itself, America's foreign policy. Do we have a right and perhaps a responsibility to spread democracy abroad, to spread Christianity? These have been historical questions that have been asked and answered by the United States, and some people like the way we've answered them, some people don't. But you definitely are impacted or influenced by this history, and a lot of folks have seen evidence in their minds, evidence of the fact that this has been a chosen nation, an exceptional nation, just in some of the history that happens. I think the Louisiana Purchase is definitely one of those. And it's interesting that this is kind of the signal achievement of Jefferson's first administration, right? Because he wants to shrink government, yet he's going to make this huge purchase that even he doesn't know if it's constitutional or not. He's kind of unsure, and as he's writing the check, he's like, "Ooh, I hope this works." Too good a deal. It's too good a deal to pass up. It's just way too good a deal. And it's happened in part because France finds itself in some difficulties. Right? To take it back to some of the issues we've been discussing, Napoleon wants to conquer the world, but he's just lost his most valuable slave colony in Haiti. He needs cash, and so when they send these emissaries to buy New Orleans, suddenly they are offered the whole Louisiana territory from the French for $15 million. And of course they're going to take it. It's going to double the size of the country. Signing of a check. Now, if that's not a miracle, some say, what is? So it's interesting to me that this is one of the signal achievements of Jefferson's administration, even though he wanted to shrink, to cut taxes, right, to cut spending and go these other directions. More than doubles the size of the country and extends our western boundaries to the Rocky Mountains. Again, when he initially sends representatives to France, the goal was to buy New Orleans. New Orleans itself was important enough. It's at the mouth of the Mississippi. It's going to open up trading routes for the nation as this new nation is trying to establish itself economically. It's going to be important enough to get that. They would have felt good with that deal. They, get much more. And that the delegation would jump at the opportunity to make this purchase. When news of the proposed treaty gets back home, Jefferson is, he's exceedingly happy, but he's also kind of concerned. But Jefferson had been one of the prime ones critiquing the Federalists for doing things that wasn't allowed in the Constitution, right? For trying to exercise powers that weren't constitutional. He's not sure if this is constitutional, yet he knows he can't pass up this deal. He's going to have to go back on some of his own beliefs, perhaps, to even make that happen. Does the federal government have the constitutional authority to make such a purchase? Well, the Senate ultimately ratifies this purchase, ratifies the treaty, and the Louisiana Territory would become part of the U.S. Much of this territory is unexplored. We sort of get this huge deal, and now got to figure out what we have. And so he would send the Lewis and Clark expedition, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Lewis was an old friend of Jefferson's, in fact, and they go on this historic mission through this territory, exploring it, mapping it, checking out the plants and animals, meeting various native peoples living in this territory to kind of scope it all out and find out what they've got, right? Sort of find out what they've got. The Lewis and Clark expedition sets out from St. Louis in 1804, and they reach the Pacific Ocean late the following year. So think about manifest destiny, right? This idea that we are destined to spread from the original 13 colonies on the East Coast all the way to the West Coast. That's going to become a reality with California's addition as a state in 1850. Although their primary mission was to find an all-water route to the Pacific, which can't happen because mountains are in the way, and to facilitate trade with Asia, this is a very successful trip. They catalog any number of things, plants and animals in the area, so on and so forth. For a number of decades, much of what we knew about the territory would come from this one expedition. Sort of learn slowly as we move further and further west, more and more about it. So this is a huge success for Jefferson. In terms of foreign policy, he wasn't so successful. There was a conflict with Tripoli that happens during his tenure in this first administration. He's trying to protect American interests, merchant vessels and whatnot from pirates operating. But this really overshadows everything. Right? This Louisiana Purchase is going to overshadow everything. Again, the very seeds of America's growing power may also contain its destruction. Right? To use the title of the previous video, Seeds of Destruction, when we're talking about cotton. Because the nation's going to be doubled with all this new agricultural territory. Right? Cotton is going to explode, especially after the cotton gin. Yet, with every addition of a state comes this question: are these going to be slave or free states? There's a tension rising between North and South as to how this is going to play out. What is the direction of the country going to be? And is one going to be more dominant than the other? Ultimately, we're going to find that this leads us closer and closer towards war. So some say we're already on the road to civil war by this point. What we're quickly moving into is a period of, we generally know as a period of sort of nation building or nationalism. Right? The early nation is developing rapidly, but also dealing with some of the continuing contradictions in this period. Jefferson himself has to kind of figure out how the new nation is going to relate to some of the other nations of the world. Right? What's our relationship with France going to be? What's our relationship with Great Britain going to be? What happens with Great Britain and France are at war with each other? Right? How do we sort of navigate those difficult waters? Particularly, conflicts between England and France are going to continue to impact the U.S. For example, as tensions re-intensify between Britain and France and they find themselves at war, we find ourselves trying to figure out how that impacts us. Can we still continue to trade with Great Britain, our number one trading partner? We still continue to have good relations with France, who helped us during our revolution against Great Britain, without either side feeling like we're taking sides. It's going to be very difficult to kind of navigate those waters. For example, when those tensions increase, Jefferson himself would make a decision at one point to halt all trade with both nations. He says, okay, as long as you guys are at war, we'll halt all trade with all warring nations. Until these nations agreed to give safe passage to American vessels. Right? We're tired of America's trading vessels getting caught up in these tensions between Britain and France. Ultimately, though, this is going to be harmful to the American economy. We have these important trade connections, particularly with England. And this is seen as hurting the country. It's particularly seen as hurting the New England region. And New England tends to be more heavily involved in shipping out of finished products and trade and merchants, dominant in places like Boston, whereas the South is generally more about raw materials, production of cotton and whatnot. So the regions themselves are already seeing themselves as having different interests. Right? So New England takes it as kind of an attack on them, that we've sort of halted trade with their number one trading partner. See how the regions are already interpreting things that happen from a regional perspective, not just from an American perspective. So cities like Boston and Newport, Rhode Island, are heavily impacted by Jefferson's decision. They're so heavily impacted and invested in trade, heavily invested in shipbuilding, for example, that this impacts them more than others. So the Embargo Act of 1807, the Embargo Act would actually widen the gulf between the political parties. The Federalists tend to be strongest in New England, and the Anti-Federalists and or Democratic Republicans, as they call themselves, tend to be stronger in the South. The two parties have a regional identity already. And think ahead about 40, 50 years how this is going to be particularly important on the road to the Civil War. Also, this Embargo Act doesn't really solve the problem. It doesn't really force England and France to respect our neutrality. It doesn't really work in that respect. Relations with England continue to deteriorate. Ultimately, they're going to lead to a second war with England, the War of 1812, which we'll talk about in a second. And it also leads to increased tensions with France. So it kind of does the opposite of what we might want. It hurts our economy and it increases tensions with both nations in the United States. War is becoming more and more likely by the end of Jefferson's tenure in 1809. So many see his second term as far less successful than his first term. This sort of launches us into this period of nation building or nationalism between about 1809 and 1828. It's going to cover the administrations of several presidents, 1809 to 1828, really this era of nation building, thinking about the growth of the country. 1809 would see the inauguration of President Madison, James Madison. 1828 is going to see the rise of Andrew Jackson and kind of the birth of Jacksonian America, which we'll get into a bit next time. So it's an important period in terms of our early nation building efforts. During this period, we survive a second war with Great Britain. And again, further evidence that we might have some sort of exceptional mission in the eyes of God. We survived the second war, the War of 1812. Again, as we said, Jefferson is really unable to kind of manage the tensions between Britain and France, and this may have set us on the path to war with Great Britain once again. But by the time Madison is in power, this war is going to really kick off, and tensions increase further. Maybe it's just, Madison's bad luck. He kind of walks into this, right? But Britain is doing things that require an American response as well. The British, for example, would continue a policy that had started of seizing American ships. They figure they're at war with France, and so any ship trading with France is fair game. Right, we're kind of like, wait a second, we're not involved in this, we're just trying to trade. So the fact that they're seizing American ships is really an act of war. You do that, this is an act of war. They also would begin impressing American sailors, basically kidnapping American sailors and forcing them into the British Navy. Obviously, no independent nation can stand for these activities, right? So if you consider yourself an independent nation worthy of respect, there needs to be some response. Right? So it's not a surprise that the second conflict is going to happen just based on these two events, but there are some other events as well that we did not like leading to the War of 1812. For example, Native Americans. Native Americans played a role in this move towards the War of 1812. And we felt like, especially in areas of the West, that the British were trying to stir up Native American populations to cause problems for the growing American nation. Now, again, there are still natives present, especially the further west you go. Some groups that have been able to remove themselves from the direct path of sort of American growth. And this sort of raises a larger issue. Native Americans have several choices that they're making in terms of trying to survive and flourish in this period. Even as the United States is growing in power, we're no longer colonies. There are still a number of choices that Native peoples are going to make. We suspect the British of trying to instigate Native Americans towards violence. We think the British are kind of in their ear saying, look, if you don't do something now, the Americans are going to overrun you pretty quickly. You might want to attack now. Maybe we'll help you a little bit. Like these sorts of messages, Americans start to feel that the British are pushing for Native Americans. As more and more American settlers push further and further west, particularly after Louisiana Purchase opens up that territory, this is going to come to a head. Some native populations will start to mount more organized resistance. They decide to maybe resist violently or move further west. Others are going to make different choices. And I'll give you a couple of examples here. For example, the Shawnee spiritual leader, Tenskwatawa, is a good example of the choices that native populations would make and how they sometimes disagreed even with one another over how to respond to the growing American nation. So Tenskwatawa is a spiritual leader, also known as the prophet. Tenskwatawa would begin preaching about kind of revitalizing native cultures from the inside out. It says, how do you respond to this? Work on your own culture. Turn inward. That's what Tenskwatawa would say. Revitalize native cultures, do things like resist alcohol, purify yourself, to try to prevent further encroachments by Americans. So Tenskwatawa says, look inward. Don't worry so much about what's happening out there. Worry about yourself.
Like you've heard that before.
Hmm?
You should feel like you've heard that before.
Heard that message. Is it going to work though, right? Even within his own people, there are some that say, you're a dreamer. Right? This is not going to work. So although Tenskwatawa was really preaching a form of nonviolent resistance, he's going to be loudly criticized by others, including his own brother. His brother was named Tecumseh. Tecumseh advocated the use of force. Tecumseh was like, look, this needs to be the line in the sand. Anyone crossing this needs to be dealt with now. If you don't do it now, we reach the tipping point. Right? This nation is too powerful to deal with, and it's only going to get stronger. So you have to draw this line in the sand was Tecumseh's vision. Right? Force could be used and should be used. So in 1811, the governor of the Indiana Territory, a man named William Henry Harrison, would be a future president, would lead U.S. troops in a battle against the Shawnee at a place called Tippecanoe. So this is going to come to a head in 1811. Although more American lives were actually lost than Shawnee lives in this, it forces Tecumseh to seek assistance from the British. So from the American perspective, this is further confirmation that the British are involving themselves in our affairs, right? That they're stirring up natives, and it leads to increased tensions with the British. The American Congress would become more and more hostile towards the British and think that we needed to go to war. They start to split into war hawks, as they call themselves, right? Those that were in favor of war to defend American honor and land and whatnot, right? Congress is becoming more and more hostile to the British in the months leading up to the War of 1812. And the British are still kind of a nuisance for us in a sense, right? The British still did maintain several forts, for example, in the Northwest Territory, despite the provisions of the Treaty of Paris that ended the Revolution. They still had a military presence there that angered some, and that seemed like they were going to be in the way of manifest destiny. How are we going to move all the way to the West Coast if the British are still kind of hanging out there? Right? By 1811, Congress is increasingly in favor of war with England, and these war hawks are becoming louder and louder. They would appeal not only to ideas of American nationalism, national pride and respect, but also to economics, also to this idea of expanding territory, expanding our land west. I can't say the word. Expanding west. Manifest destiny. If it's God's idea that we expand to the West Coast, anybody that gets in the way of that has to be dealt with, including Britain, including the Native Americans that are there. They're seen as a problem. They're seen as an obstacle to be overcome. So in June of 1812, Madison would ask for a formal declaration of war. There are a number of perhaps factors and motivations going into this. Some war hawks wanted to go to war with Britain to take Canada. Some thought that Manifest Destiny included not only going to the West Coast, but taking Canada as well. Fighting would begin along the Great Lakes within a month or so after this declaration. Who really wins? Well, the War of 1812 was seen largely as a kind of stalemate, as a draw. Both sides could kind of claim some successes in that. American attempts to seize Canada, for example, were unsuccessful. But the British, they burned down Washington, D.C. That's pretty good from their perspective, militarily speaking. But they're not able to sort of rout the American forces. They're not able to win in the way that they also thought they might. They're not able to sort of deal that decisive blow. After the British left Washington, they would lay siege to Baltimore. You know the story. I've been done some of the tours in Baltimore. You said what?
I actually just did that last week.
I did a couple weeks ago too. For the first time. Pretty cool. They would attack in September 1814, and during that battle that a physician named Francis Scott Key would pen, well, it's first a poem and later put to music, the Star Spangled Banner. It becomes America's national anthem. I think often we think that came out of the Revolution, but it didn't. It came out of the War of 1812. Rockets, red glare, bombs bursting in air, flag was there, all that stuff. That was about Baltimore, not necessarily about them. I did too. It just seemed like it would, but it's actually, to me, maybe it shows how the two are connected in the minds of many Americans, right? This notion of becoming a nation and becoming a stronger nation. About 40 years later, part of the same process in a sense. So again, both sides claim victories. Many are emboldened. Americans are emboldened by this, though. Once again, we've survived another conflict with this major power. It's maybe some reasons for believing that again we have a chosen kind of mission. Treaty would end the war. The Treaty of Ghent would end the war. It's signed in December 1814, and really left all the issues unresolved that had gone into the war. So not much is resolved by this treaty. But there is something significant that comes out of it. Because news of the treaty takes so long to get back to the United States, fighting continued even after the treaty had been signed. So the treaty signed in December 1814, but there's actually an important battle that happens early January 1815. The Battle of New Orleans. This is significant in part because it's going to propel Andrew Jackson to prominence. He kind of makes a major name for himself at the Battle of New Orleans. And this is later going to help kind of catapult him to the White House, enable the whole Jacksonian America thing to happen. So even though it was more of a symbolic victory, it's important for American history. Perhaps helps to create sort of future American president. Andrew Jackson is going to be president from 1829 to 1837. And this really the whole period of the 1820s and 30s is kind of named after him. So the Jacksonian America, the rise of the common man, these sorts of things. We'll talk more about that. Other things of significance coming out of the War of 1812. Politically, it does have an impact politically on our history. Again, the fact that the United States had survived another war intact, again, is pride, pride for us. Jackson's victory at the Battle of New Orleans, watching too much football. Again, fuels American pride. We can kind of stand toe to toe with any nation. We come to believe by this point. It fuels a sense of nationalism. It also would be the beginning of the end for the Federalist Party. It's going to be the beginning of the end for the Federalist Party. And with the Federalist Party had always considered themselves closer to Britain. So the Federalists had actually opposed the War of 1812. So it's not a good idea to go to war with your number one trading partner, who you are closest to culturally. This is going to be seen as an unpopular view once you're at war. And the Federalists did one more thing that may have kind of put the nail in their coffin. They decided as the war was drawing to a close to have a meeting in Hartford, Connecticut. They meet in Hartford, Connecticut, known as the Hartford Convention, to discuss ways of amending the Constitution to limit presidential powers and to kind of strike a better balance of power. Now, again, there may have been different reasons for this. I mean, the Federalists had always been the ones arguing for more federal power, but now Jefferson and now Madison are in power, so perhaps they want to rethink that. But perhaps they were just being good Americans, right? Thinking about checks and balances, and balance of power, and whatnot. Who knows? Different ones may have been had different motivations. What they do, though, is they decide to meet and discuss these issues during time of war, and they are seen as un-American for doing so. Some think this is treason. This is traitorous behavior to do so during times of war. Federalists are never again going to be able to regain their position of political prominence after this. And they ultimately are going to fade into history. They're going to be replaced by a new political party, the Whig Party. With the War of 1812 over, Americans can now focus their attention on expansion, on nation building, on some of these questions and contradictions that we've been dealing with and thinking about. How is the nation going to progress? What's the future direction of the country? How is North, South, and West going to sort of figure things out? Also, this demise of the Federalist Party means that the Democrats, they now are calling themselves, are largely unopposed for a minute. Their main enemy is now weakened. They can kind of do what they want in some respects. So they're really able to govern without the significant opposition of the Federalists for at least the next few years, until a new political party, the Whig Party, would emerge.
Are they Republicans?
They call themselves Democrats. Their names are a little difficult. The Anti-Federalists is what they initially were called by the Federalists. They really always called themselves Democratic Republicans. And then they become Democrats. Republicans are going to be later on with Lincoln, right before the Civil War, in fact. Native Americans are still an issue here. One of the things about nation building and Manifest Destiny in the West, and the idea of this progress is what happens to folks that are seen as being in the way. What's going to happen to them? There are different opinions as to how to deal with, quote unquote, the Indian problem. Andrew Jackson, for example, had a very simple solution: extermination. He thought extermination would be the best route, that Native Americans were in the way, they should be removed so the country could be great. Others think that perhaps natives can be assimilated, sort of brought into the society in various ways. But Andrew Jackson, sort of known as the Indian killer, Indian hater. So you can kind of get a sense of how there might be extreme views about that. What's going to happen with these native populations? What should happen with them? Especially the ones that live east of the Appalachian Mountains are seen as being in the way of progress, and that they either have to be defeated or removed. This notion of Indian removal is gaining more and more momentum. That they should be removed, that their lands should be ceded to the growing nation. Beginning in 1815, a series of treaties would uproot various Native American societies, culminating with the forced removal of the so-called 5 civilized tribes. 5 civilized tribes. Those were Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, Creek, and Cherokee. Can't read this writing myself. So between 1815 and the 1830s, you see this increase in a push for Indian removal. Right? Removal would culminate in 1838 with the forced removal of the Cherokee to Oklahoma along what's known as the Trail of Tears. Essentially, this forced march, really forced removal. Right? It's going to cause the death of many. But think of it as kind of I guess, a part of this process of expansion, manifest destiny. They're seen as in the way of progress, in the way of what God wants, in the way of national growth. And so some are willing to justify any number of things to achieve what they saw as divinely ordained.
Like how people were able to justify slavery.
Very good parallel. Native Americans are often seen as an internal enemy. Slaves were often seen as an internal enemy, something to be dealt with. They're within the borders, but they're seen as outsiders or enemies. It's a really good parallel, in fact. In addition to westward expansion, when we think about how the nation is growing, there is also a revolution in transportation. Revolution in transportation during this period. You see the development of things like public and private toll roads that are helping to connect the nation. By the 1830s, you actually see some of the first railroads, very early railroads, although much more later on, connecting the nation together. Think Imagine Community, right? It's easier to travel when you have better roads and railroads connecting, and better use of the rivers. In fact, rivers were the major form of transportation in this period. You wanted to have rivers that were navigable, and you could easily travel them. And they're much more important to economic development in this period. The Mississippi River, the Ohio, for example, the Missouri, and their tributaries would allow the movement of goods and services across regions. But there are other things being developed, and technology plays into this American growth as well, this American economic growth. That's going to be able to do things like connect the East, kind of the old money of the East, to the frontier and the farms. With the development of the steamboat, water transportation becomes much more practical. Since goods can now be moved up and down river much more easily. Finally, the construction of canals. Again, this technology that allows national growth. Construction of canals will provide a more direct link from eastern cities, especially the financial centers that are developing in places like New York, and the West, right, this growing West. Best example is probably the Erie Canal. Best example of this boom in canal construction is the Erie Canal. Erie Canal was completed in 1825. It would connect New York City with the Great Lakes region. It's a 364-mile waterway. Right? So think about the technological success that is in the 1820s. And it helps make New York City a much more important factor. And now you have this connection between this financial center and where the money is going to be needed, especially further and further west. Industrialization, early industrialization, as I said, characterizes this period as well, especially in the Northeast. You have the growth of these textile mills, for example, in places like Lowell, Massachusetts, right, that are going to spin cotton and make it usable.
Mill girls?
The mill girls in Lowell, especially younger single women that work in these mills, spinning. Usually these women, once they married, wouldn't leave the mills, right? Leave this employment because about the time period. But they are an important part of this early industrialization, these mill girls in the 1820s and 1830s. But again, as this is happening and as this West is developing, these questions keep coming back up. Right? What is this West going to look like? And how is that going to impact the rest of the nation? Westward expansion would highlight some of the same controversies over slavery that we keep coming back to. As new territories are settled, and as these settlers apply for statehood, specifically the question comes up, are these states going to be slave or free? And if you admit one state as a slave or a free state, is that then going to tip the balance in favor of slave or free states, which is something that folks are afraid of. Remember, going back to the Constitution, some of these compromises that had to be made between slave and free entities. Up through 1817, the North and the South had been able to maintain a kind of rough balance between slave and free. Up through 1817, they had been able to kind of compromise and manage that by alternately admitting slave and free states. But this system is going to be challenged by Missouri. Missouri is going to apply for statehood, and the same questions emerge. It wants to be a slave state, be admitted as a slave state, and Northern anti-slavery forces are opposed to it being admitted, because this is going to tip the balance, they fear, in favor of what they call the slaveocracy, those states that are heavily invested in the slave trade and that therefore will use that power to dominate the North. So what do? They compromise. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 is an important kind of tipping point. What it does is it admits Missouri as a slave state. Missouri Compromise of 1820 admits Missouri as a slave state. But in order to balance the number of slave and free, they would create a state in the North, Maine. Maine is sort of chopped off of part of Massachusetts, becomes its own state. So that keeps the balance equal in terms of slave and free states. So again, you can kind of see how artificial in some ways it is here to try to maintain this political balance as the nation is growing. Maine had been part of Massachusetts. It's created in 1820. Look at Maine's license plate today. Is it live free or die?
That was New Hampshire.
Is that New Hampshire?
Yeah.
You're probably right. Sometimes I lie. I've never been to either one. I gotta go. What also happens with Missouri is that it sets a line, sets a kind of temporary, at least, line between slave and free. Subsequent states or later states that are going to be admitted to the north of Missouri are technically supposed to be free states. Those admitted that are south of what they call the 3630 line are supposed to be slave states. So again, sets a line moving forward, because we already know that we're moving further and further west and that more states will be added. So this Missouri Compromise is trying to lay a blueprint to keep these tensions at bay. So south of Missouri's southern boundary would allow slavery. Again, it's already assumed that we're going west, even if that means conflict with Great Britain, even if that means conflict with Mexico, around Texas and other areas. It's already sort of written, right? We're going west, so whoever's in the way better get ready. We'll see how that, again, plays out. The Missouri Compromise does work, at least temporarily. It gets the state admitted. It sort of calms down this major sectional crisis that's developing around slavery. But it does fail to create a permanent solution. It fails to create a permanent solution to the issue. These things are going to come back again. And again, within 40 years, we're not going to be able to manage them with compromise. Lastly, in terms of foreign policy, we see President James Monroe come. He has 8 years between 1817 and 1825. President Monroe. Some see this as what they call an era of good feelings. Things calmed down for a while under Monroe. It's kind of an end to the harsh party politics and bitter partisanship, at least temporarily. It's the era of good feelings. Perhaps most notably, Monroe makes a pronouncement about foreign policy, known as the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. The Monroe Doctrine is seen as kind of an example of how America is looking at itself at this point, and how it's looking at its place in the world in 1823. The Monroe Doctrine would declare that the U.S. would strongly oppose any European meddling in our half of the hemisphere. Right? We say, as long as Europe stays out of the Western Hemisphere, we're okay. We won't involve ourselves in European affairs. You don't involve yourself over on this side. So we kind of, in a way, kind of threaten. Like, if you come here and do stuff, we might have a problem. We really didn't have the power yet to kind of back that up, but it's important that we, felt strongly enough to kind of put that out there. The U.S. would stay out of European affairs. Europe should stay out of the Western Hemisphere in our backyard, including the Caribbean. although the Monroe Doctrine has little immediate effect, many see it as kind of setting the agenda for the next 100 years in terms of America's changing vision of itself, right? Remember, Washington was talking about staying out of European affairs as much as possible, kind of staying at home. We are now saying, well, we'll do that as long as you don't come to this side of the world. Right? We feel important enough to kind of challenge some of that. So this is an important era in terms of this nation-building period, and pretty quickly moving into Jacksonian America, which we'll talk about next time. Jackson is going to be elected, and it's seen as what they call the rise of the common man, the era of the common man, Jacksonian America. Those two terms are kind of used interchangeably, in part because of Jackson himself. There are going to be a number of contradictions that come out of that period as well that we can reference. There's this idea that there's an expansion of democracy during this period of Jacksonian America, the 1820s and the 1830s. Expansion of democracy. And in part that's true. But in some ways, there are still very strong limits on democracy that we can talk about. Give you one term that illustrates that, and then we'll come back to this. See what you guys can tell me about this term that becomes heavily used during the era of Jacksonian democracy. We can break it down and see some of the contradictions inherent in it. First of all, what's the term suffrage mean? I think I've asked you that before. What's suffrage refer to?
Right to vote.
Right to vote. So suffrage or the franchise, enfranchisement, all those terms refer to the right, voting rights and sort of political rights. I think women's suffrage, later in this century. What's the term universal refer to? Everyone should apply to all, right, equally. So if you generally look at the first two words, universal suffrage, that means everybody has the right to vote under Jacksonian America. Everybody has the right to vote, right? No, not quite, because there are a couple of qualifiers included in the term as well. Even though you are going to see an expansion of democracy in this period. For example, I think it's as of about 1820, almost all states have gotten rid of property qualifications for voting. So you think, okay, this is great. This is an expansion of democracy. More people, more Americans are going to be able to vote. I go from a small percentage of white males with a certain level of property that can vote to now allowing white males to vote. So there is an expansion of democracy in this period. I can't argue that. At the same time, there are important qualifications on that. So women don't get that right, of course. Native Americans don't get that right. African Americans don't get that right. Chinese laborers, most people still don't have the right, But there is an expansion of democracy. So we're seeing two things at the same time. Right? The gender and the race stuff is still important. But under Jackson, in this era, you do see an expansion. You're going to see some changes in politics that we can talk about. Jackson is effective at kind of speaking directly to the American people in a way that earlier presidents didn't seem to kind of be able to do. He does things like when he's running for office, he has parades and barbecues and picnics.
Wasn't he known for a inaugural house party?
Exactly.
At the White House.
Exactly. He's comedian. And whenever you want to reach someone or change their mind or get them to support your feet, see the history department has an open house today. They have cookies and punch, so we're trying to bribe the guys to become history majors. But Jackson and others are going to realize this, and they appeal directly to the people. He comes to be seen as the guy next door, common man. In some ways, he is. He's from Tennessee, not from Virginia or Boston. From a frontier, kind of non-elite in some ways. But he's going to be an interesting figure in and of itself. So we'll talk more about that. But I wanted to put that term up there, even as we're talking about Jacksonian America and the expansion of democracy. We also are going to see some limits that remain on that democracy. Yet, again, we're right in the middle now of some of the tensions that are really leading us on the road to the Civil War. I want you to continue to think about those tensions. If you look at the textbook and the way it's organized, really the last 4 or 5 chapters all talk about the same period, the same things, the same era. And they're really all emphasizing these same questions. We're winding down. We're almost done. You guys are doing good hanging with me. We have 3 more meetings, and it's all over. And I'm going to insist that none of you shed any tears on that last day. If you start crying, I'm gonna cry. That's not pretty. Why you sound so excited about it? Yeah, it's Thursday, Tuesday, Thursday. That's it. I'm preparing a study guide. The final will have to do with things since the Revolution. So think 1800 to 1860, these ideas that we're talking about now. But I'll give you more specifics on that. I'm trying to prepare a study guide as of Thursday. Our test is scheduled for the 17th. We'll talk more about that on Thursday since the door is open. I'm trying to be more flexible on that. So we'll talk more about that on Thursday since the door is open. Not required to hold all exams at the appointed time since the door is open. We'll talk more about that on Thursday. What I want you to do is continue working through these materials. I'm trying to get ahead. We noticed that we stayed behind in lecture for a lot of times. We're now getting back ahead. So the stuff we're talking about now actually comes up in several of the chapters, 8, 9, and 10. We're going to talk about the market revolution a little bit and the rise of the middle class. We'll talk about manifest destiny some more, exceptionalism, and the coming of the Civil War. We are going to end with chapter 13, before the Civil War. So you don't have to worry about 14 and 15 in terms of Civil War and Reconstruction. All right? So we're going up to 13. Just to give you a heads up. All right. See you on Thursday.
Got me in a damn elevator.